a panel that's going to discuss success stories in cases of success in business development. And to moderate the next session, I have Susan Welsh of Grimaldo. She's a very well-known analyst in the telecommunications space. She's with Strategy Analytics. You've probably read her stuff in the past. So I'd like to welcome up Susan. Susan, and while you do your intro, I'd like to invite your panelists to take their places behind you. So, Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you. Great to see everyone here after lunch. Hopefully everybody's nice and awake. I'm actually going to start out with a question for the audience while the panel's coming up. How many of you are with operators or service providers? Handful of you, great. How many of you are with startups? Okay, good number, great. So this is a perfect panel for all of you. It's wonderful to see what TC3 is doing here and Telecom Council and talking about how to bridge the gap and make a win-win situation between the operators and the carriers from around the world and many startups, both local here and from other areas, who come together and try to find how to work together. And we're going to have a great panel today, and we're discussing here startup success stories. So these are companies that were the small startups, and they've gotten a little further along on their road. So they're going to talk about some of the things that have helped them to be successful, challenges that they've run into along the way, and hopefully some great advice and ideas for you to take home with you. So I hope we'll get a couple of good takeaways for everyone here. So I'm going to go ahead and do just very quick introductions and then have them talk very briefly what their company does in case you're not familiar with them. And then we're going to run through some questions. So we have, let's see, we've got Oren here from Ruckus Wireless. We have Amitava from Redshift Networks. And we have Steve from Parallel Wireless. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Oren if he wants to give a quick introduction to himself and his company, and then we'll jump into some questions. And then we'll have room for some Q&A at the end.
Sure. So again, Oren Binder, Director of Service Provider Marketing at Ruckus Wireless. We sit about 15 minutes down the road here at Sunnyvale. Pretty famous for our Wi-Fi access points and wireless solutions in general. Recently, we just acquired by Brocade a few months ago. So now we're in the transition kind of under Brocade. Yeah.
Great.
My name is Amitava Mukherjee. I'm the CEO of Redshift Networks. We're also about 40 minutes down the road in San Ramon. We're focused in the VoIP security, analytics, and fraud space. We work with a lot of major operators here in the US and around the world. Some of our customers include Frontier, Cincinnati Bell. We're working with Comcast, CenturyLink, others. And we're seeing a lot of huge attacks in VoIP, and we're using analytics to look at those threats in mobile, fixed, carrier, enterprise VoIP, and different types of operators. Thank you.
I'm Steve Papa, founder and CEO of Parallel Wireless. I grew up in rural America, and what we're trying to do is change the economics of rural cellular to bring much needed coverage to those places, also working with sort of public safety cellular networks. And we're based in the Boston area.
Great. Well, I'm going to start off and actually ask Steve to tell us a little bit of how the story of how Parallel Wireless got going and really made some progress working with an operator. If you kind of talk a little bit about some of the things that really helped to start that dialogue and to get you further along the success there.
Sure. If you think, so the way we got going, there were 3 founders that had built many different parts of the cell network over their careers, from the core to access to backhaul. And they had imagined different ways to allocate responsibilities that would take out a lot of cost in deploying networks. Myself, my background has been involved in the data center, so I'm actually an outsider. I was involved in putting the first Intel PC chips into the enterprise back in the 90s. So learned a lot from that process that the data center went through to where it is today. And so we started doing this. And our early customer relationships, luck is always better to be lucky than to be smart, is the phrase that I like to use. So basically, I was literally at a conference, not that different than this. I described my role as CEO as often cultivating serendipity. You got to be in places where you're going to meet interesting people. You see where it leads. You try to be helpful. And I literally at a conference like this sat down next to someone that said, Olaf Swanti, CEO of EE. And I'm in the UK. I'm like, EE? I'm like, that's not very descriptive, right? He goes, EE, we're the largest LTE network in Europe. I'm like, oh. So, because they had just changed the name, and I wasn't familiar with it. So we spoke briefly. He talked a lot about some of his challenges and started engaging with his team. And I'd say what was really important for us is a willingness we weren't taking a product saying, this is the product, how does it work in your environment? We took an approach as, what's your problem in your environment, and how are we going to innovate in ways to actually address it? Okay, you got to look at your core strengths as a small company, right? We're a small company. We don't have lots of things off the shelf, but we're fast moving. We're not weighed down by existing things so that we could rapidly innovate. So building a lot of trust and investing the time and effort to understand the problem all the way down to the details of the particular zoning restrictions that exist in the UK, right? And they're not even universal across the country, right? How are you going to do things that are just going to take cost out of the equation to solve what's a strategic problem, right? And, I think that's probably a good starting point.
Great, yeah, it's really helpful to hear. I mean, obviously luck played a role, getting into the right conversation with the right person, thinking about how to solve their problem, and together working towards solving that real pain point that was strategic to them.
Yeah, I'll add just expand on two things there. One is, this difference between a sales force that's taking existing products and pushing it into customers versus taking sort of the entrepreneurs and working with the customer to solve the problem. Those are very different experiences, and it's part of the life cycle of growing a business. You start out that way. Obviously, that doesn't scale, right? And then what you need to do is, how many people here know Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, right? Yeah. See a few folks, right? It's a framework for thinking about customer adoption from early adopters to late adopters. And what's important in this market, and I've been involved in bringing many different technologies to the market. I've founded many companies, et cetera, over the years. But is you can't take a monolithic view of any one company, right? Any one company might be really slow in one area and be the late adopter. There might be an early adopter somewhere else, as well as by individual, right? So there's company culture, there's problem space, and then there's the individuals tackling that problem. So I've had people tell me, stay away from operator X. They're so slow. They still think copper is the future, right, for wireless. But operator X is turning out to be an incredibly fast mover because I've intersected with a problem space that's really important to them, and they're early adopters there. So.
Great. Yeah, I think finding that problem space is key. Amitava, how did you get sort of started? What got you into dialogue with some of your first carriers that jumped into you and helped you kind of move along to become a bigger company?
Yeah, so basically we started off, so we're focused on VoIP security, so basically SIP security, and sort of all these carrier networks are moving towards SIP, as you know, and you know it today, of course. So when we started, there weren't many carriers implementing SIP, so there was a lot of sort of initial deployments in SIP. And also, we were also focused initially in the enterprise space. And enterprise, of course, we're doing VoIP security, so we're working with PBXs like Cisco and Avaya and others. And we also saw that space wasn't very prevalent in SIP. They were doing proprietary protocols. As the operators started offering enterprise VoIP services, we started focusing on the operators. But there were, again, the more innovative operators doing enterprise VoIP services. As we started working with the operators, we started seeing that, as Steve was saying, they wanted new features. They wanted new things with our product, because as our product was on the network, we could add a lot of features that they were looking for. It was a little sort of tangent to the space we were in, so it wasn't specifically in security. So then we started adding fraud, which was a big problem. We was talking with Steve about that. And fraud is, of course, a huge issue in carrier networks, but we're looking at it from the VoIP security side, so a SIP IP side, which is very different from how a lot of the fraud vendors today look at it. So that became very interesting for carriers. And as we were in the networks, a lot of the carriers says, oh, well, since you're looking at SIP packets, can you add analytics into it? I said, yeah, of course. So basically, our product evolved into looking at analytics and using analytics to do then security and fraud. So that was very interesting. So our product managers, our product managers are really the carriers. So they're not us, which is interesting. We give them ideas, or at least a framework, and then they add in all the functionalities they want. So what's interesting now, we're right now at a point where we are working with some of the larger carriers in the world. And interestingly, because we had so much input from like 45 to 50 different operators around the world, each one wanted to add their own sort of unique things. And it turned out that all of them like those unique things. So now we have a really interesting platform. When we go to operators, they all nod their head. Security is always an issue where you're always chasing a problem, because if you look at security markets, each security market you had to wait until the attacks really happen. So now SIP attacks are aggressively happening because of the pervasiveness of SIP. And so now our market is really picking up for it. So we had to add certain functions that were a little around our product set as the attacks didn't happen. And when the market started up, everyone loved our product. So yes, it was an evolution.
So it's an evolution,
product.
listening very
Yes.
carefully to your customer, working with them
Definitely.
collectively to pull in different things and add things on the edges of your product. That sounds great. Great start.
And it's interesting because when we say is, of course, the joke we always say is that, and excuse me if there's anyone from Cisco here, if Cisco will take a year to do it, we can do it in 2 days or 3 days, right? So that's sort of all operators love that. So we do that a lot, right?
Yeah, great. And Oren, let's hear a little bit from Ruckus Wireless, how you work with some of the carriers, what's helped you as you've made that story from early startup to where you are today.
Right, so if we go back, and again, this is before my time a little bit at Ruckus, but we go back about 6, 7 years ago, the challenge was really with Wi-Fi is to get into that room together with and if you mention the name already, I can mention it too, with the Cisco access point and the HP and the Aruba, the other access points that were in that room of the service provider that they were evaluating, and just inserting yourself to get into that bake-off. So that was the first challenge right off the bat. So actually, with Ruckus, they started through the enterprises. So going into channels, pushing through channels to enterprises, and in parallel, building a brand. So that's something they did very well early on. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Ruckus dog. They made a lot of noise back then, and again, I'm going back 6, 7 years ago, well beyond their size. So both building the brand and getting to the enterprises and getting the brand out there and getting some sort of credibility got us into the first service providers, because all we wanted to do was first get into the evaluations there. And from there, it was about pushing. We have different patents, and again, we had great confidence in the access points themselves. So once we were in that room, it was just a matter of making them shine, and like was mentioned here, I don't want to say over-promising, but promising and getting really quick back to any change requests and things we knew that the bigger vendors wouldn't do, but within a week sometimes we'd be coming back with some sort of modifications and really showing them that we're going to be lean and mean and again, meet your different...
Right, so being fast, being responsive,
right.
Taking that route of finding the way to build that credibility to get in the door and compete.
Right, after the initial credibility, okay, our access points are good, but now let's say we have this special request here, everybody has their own quirky stuff that they want to do.
Right.
Really hammering that, getting back fast to them, and from there it was, thousands of access points at KDDI and a few other early wins, which really kind of took off.
And as a smaller company starting out, were there challenges to taking that next step to scale and say, okay, if we have more than one opportunity, which ones can we go after? Because I sometimes hear that from startups. I'm sure probably some of you in the room have that. How do you go after the opportunities, pick the right ones, and scale to those, and then still be responsive very much and interactive to that customer? Because that takes people, that takes time. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so if you want to answer, I can answer that.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So definitely we're seeing that a lot. So basically, of course, in initial stages, anyone who would want to talk to us, we would be glad to talk to them, of course, because that's the other process. And you develop the features, whatever they wanted. So there was a lot of, even a small deal, maybe a $50,000 deal, $100,000 deal, we'd spend 6, 7, 8 months in them because, of course, carriers, as you know, there's a long process with them, and we do whatever they want, right? We'd nod our heads, basically, and say, oh, that'll be interesting. But as we got a little more mature and we got into more and more networks, of course, then you start looking at, okay, what is strategic for the company? What are the large operators? What are the geographies you want to focus on? Because again, geography is an issue because, if you're in San Ramon, you can't be flying off to China or Japan every time when you're a small startup.
And direct flights.
Well, there are, but it's costly. You know how it is, right? So it's much easier to have U.S. operators. And also what we're seeing also, in certain industries, there are some similarities between cultures, right? So in other words, in the U.S., if we have some reference accounts here, other operators in the U.S. would be very interested in talking to us. Or we say, oh, we have an operator in Malaysia or in Thailand, even though they're very good countries, people aren't that interested. So you got to sort of focus in on specific geographies and also have references for carriers that are specific to your size and type of carrier. Right? So that was really important for us. So that kind of thinking we're using and looking at what was the long-term strategy and then getting there, bit by bit. We definitely had to go from the smaller to the larger operators and then broaden ourselves out.
So start out potentially with smaller operators and get going in your
right.
chosen geography, push that, get them to then champion you to others. Because I think that's actually one very important role of the operators is, especially if it's someone you're not competing with in another region, is really helping to champion. Because you obviously saw from some of the discussions this morning that, the couple slides of this is what we're looking for, a lot of similarities in terms of challenges and pain points they're trying to solve and revenue they're trying to go and costs they're trying to save. So yes, trying to help push you into new areas. That's a good question. Anyone else want to talk about sort of?
Yeah, just
Okay.
to add to what
Yeah.
Amitava said, you got to think of building a technology company as I describe it as the relentless pursuit of credibility, right? Each step earns you the right to take the next one. And that's everything from, hey, the stuff, it's clear it works, or it works under these conditions in this geography, but it's also just learning the vocabulary, right? What I often find is people with innovative ideas, I mean, you see this with technologies out of academia all the time, right? Someone has a brilliant idea, but they don't know the language of the people that are implementing it in the real world, and so they're dismissed just because they don't share the same words. It doesn't mean that their ideas and their competencies aren't there. But as you engage with more and more, you start adopting the language that the customer uses, and it improves your credibility.
And yeah, one thing I do want to touch that wasn't mentioned here, and obviously you have a limited amount of arrows in your quiver. You can't go and try to pitch to 12 different tier ones. You're going to die in 10 minutes as a startup. But that's, I think, where recruiting the right people early on the account side, the sales side, and this is really the people with the relationships, which are gold. I mean, you're standing in front of, and I'm just looking for a name to name here, which I won't get in trouble, but you're standing in front of Vodafone or something in Europe, and you have 20,000 people that or at least 150 that you have on a Rolodex. You have to know where to start, what's going on, who you can talk to, and even a CEO knocking on the door, he'll just to have limited interactions. You have to be very lucky, or you have to have someone who knows what's going on inside there. And that's something that Ruckus did early stage. It could be one person, recruiting the right person who can get you in that one service provider, and from there it just could really take off.
Great. I'd be curious to hear, is there anything that either, advice you were given when you were starting, or advice you'd like to give to startups who are at a different stage, that things that were really helpful along the way to kind of keep going, to push ahead and really help you make those particular big jumps to get you to the next stage? Any advice you received or would like to give out there?
I'd throw out there, because I've learned from doing this a few times, sometimes the shortest path to achieving your goal isn't always taking the most direct approach, right? Like what I find is I take time out actually to help other folks trying to build their business and whatnot. And if I help someone else, oftentimes they can help me get to exactly where I want to go with a lot less pain. So to your point about how you navigate,
right,
whether at Vodafone or somewhere else, I've actually taken, and I do this, you never know if, so there's the cultivating serendipity that I talked about. You sit with someone actually that worked at one of those places that's building a business, and you try to help them out. And then you ask them, who's the right people, how does it operate? And they tend to be very good at navigating, and you save a lot of time. So.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry.
No, just one thing I did bring up is, and this actually comes from my experience working for a service provider, which was way long ago, but it's also be humble. So I used to get pitches, tens of pitches a month when we were trying to build. Back then it was an IPTV end-to-end project, and we needed to build a whole ecosystem. And the ones who sat in front and were talking about how they're going to boil the ocean and change the world and everything will connect and it'll be out, they lost me at like the second minute already. I mean, you have to be humble, and you have to look for that, usually, and again, this doesn't apply always, but that single insertion point where you can solve an issue, that a pain point that they currently have. That's way better than telling them, I'm going to give you this whole new platform, we'll change everything, it'll replace everything, you have to rip everything out. It's really about being humble and looking for those small insertion points. I think that's a way better strategy.
Right. And so we also did a little bit of what you were saying. So basically it's interesting because when we started talking to carriers, you went to the Vodafones of the world, and of course they heard you, but they didn't really hear you. And then you'd go to work with the smaller carriers and go back to the Vodafones of the world after a few years. And now all these guys are really excited about our technology because we've actually proven it in a lot of the smaller networks. One thing we did do, of course, is, as Steve was saying, getting the right people. That's very critical. At the same time, you have to knock on every single door. You have to go to trade shows. You have to go talk to people. I mean, it is really an effort that you have to put across the board. And then by serendipity, you'll get to the right person, right? So it isn't an effort that, you go one strategy and see if that works. You have to have multiple strategies until you start seeing one single strategy works, and then you start using that strategy. So, what I always recommend is, yes, you have, so many options of getting to a carrier or getting to a customer or a partnership, but you have to use all the options that offer it. We were from RSA to, VoiceCon, if you guys remember VoiceCon, to, of course, the GSM show in Barcelona, et cetera. And each of those opportunities gave us different people to talk to within the organizations. And at times we would talk to 10, 20 people within one operator, but slowly we got to the right person, and now we're doing a lot of very interesting things. So it is a long process, but of course you just got to go for the challenge, as they say.
Right, so it can be a long process, and I'd be curious to hear. We definitely have some service providers, operators out here in the audience. What would you sort of challenge them to do, to think about? Obviously they've made some good steps, and I've actually been doing some interesting work around digital transformation, operator innovation programs. We've seen a lot of at least talk and certainly some movement in terms of shifting how they do processes, how they think, how they may be more open to working with startups, and even how they dialogue among themselves. As you said, trying to find the right team or the right person internally can be sometimes a challenge, and even internally I think they find that sometimes. What would you challenge the operators to do a bit differently, or maybe things you've seen some do that others haven't done as well, that you think would help them to not only have a win for you, but have a win for them as they try to work with startups?
Well, just a couple points in that direction before I answer that question.
Sure.
The converse of what Amitava said is also true, is you need to figure out when you shouldn't be wasting your time with
Yes,
this,
yeah.
right?
Right.
So I've sat with folks who they're looking, the only people I work with is you're solving the problem end to end from climbing towers and, which leads it to a narrow set, and that's fine, but I'm not going to spend any time. It's not worth it, right? I've seen in some technology companies where, bringing a big innovation, and this is not specific to operators, this is more general, where you'll see a group say it won't work, they come up with all the reasons why something won't work. And in fact, this happened to a colleague of mine who was doing a silicon innovation. A year later, he comes back and says, hey, would you like the eval boards, right, to see the stuff working? And to the credit of that company, they actually got together and said, what did we get wrong? Why was it a year ago we said this wasn't work? We sort of they were being arrogant in that sense instead of listening to this highly credible person. And they moved forward, actually, and they actually made a big bet on it. And so that willingness to accept that new things are possible, right, is probably the best thing that an operator can do, right? And, I do a bit of work with the Andreessen Horowitz crowd, and Ben Horowitz liked to say big companies are really good at killing innovation. Right? And the reason why, because actually the way he puts it is they're really good at killing bad ideas, right? Because all innovation starts out as a bad idea, right? It's not fully baked, right? It's half-baked, if best. So you're going to have to do things to it to make it much better. And you're going to make it much better as you're engaging with people, as you're improving your vocabulary, learning about issues you weren't aware of, right? And some people can, on the receiving side of that, can accept it for what it is. There's something here. They're working to get it to a place. Others are just dismissive. Oh, this doesn't make any sense, right? Or you get other examples when you're continuing to improve it. You come back to that organization, right? And someone will say, oh, I talked to them 2 years ago. There's nothing there. Won't work. This kind of thing. Despite the fact that that startup may now have a bunch of customers, et cetera. So it's that willingness to keep an open mind, right? Which can be very hard when the core competence of the organization is killing bad ideas, right? Because you have great strengths, you got a great business. The last thing you want to do is waste time on things that, that won't work. But if you don't do that, you won't actually innovate either.
Good point. Yeah.
Mic 13. So I'm doing two things. I'm drawing first blood on this microphone to let the audience know they're free to walk up and communicate with your panel. And then my question is, Elon Musk had this moment where he was almost out of money in 2010, I think, and almost dead, and his company barely survived through that 2010. Any of you three have a story about how you almost didn't make it?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, no, definitely. It's always a challenging market because, we had to pivot. So, initially we started off in the enterprise space that I mentioned, and then we figured out quickly, well, not too quickly, but, in a certain time that the enterprise space wasn't the right space for us because, as I said, this is more technology related, but there wasn't a lot of deployments on SIP. And of course, the carriers are implementing SIP, so we actually had to move and migrate into the carrier. It was hard for us, but the good thing was the team had a lot of carrier background. So we're from Ascend, Cisco, Bay Networks, Nortel. So there's a lot of carrier experience in the team. So since the team had a lot of carrier experience, we said, okay, let's go after the carriers. But of course, as we all know, the carrier sales are slower, especially the larger operators and even the smaller ones I mentioned. So there was that inflection point where we said, okay, either we're going to do it or we got to go do something else, right? And so of course we did that, and it's paid off hugely. So now we're in multi-million-dollar deals with every major carrier in the U.S. and around the world. But it is, you have to make that. You have to make it quickly, and you can't do too much research to make that decision. You just got a gut feel and get it done. But of course, you do your research because at the end of the day, you have board and investors and all those other people to report to, right? So that's very important for us.
So I was at Columbia Business School last week teaching a case which was written about my previous company, which was about this very issue, right? So that company, Endeca, was founded in '99, got our first customer in 2000. We all know what happened in 2000 to technology. 2001 was the first year-over-year decline in IT spending. So there I was in the summer of 2001. Who wants to be customer number 2 of a venture-backed startup that hasn't had a customer for 12 months and is going to run out of cash in 3 months? No one was willing to be writing, to be signing on the line. And there were plenty of people interested, though, right? We ultimately ended up closing a financing the week after 9/11. In fact, the new venture capitalist was stranded in Minneapolis because the planes weren't flying. He rented the car, came back, we got the deal done, and that whole story, there's a lot behind it. And in fact, after that, we ended up closing a $2 million quarter with customers that Q4. So all these people that were interested just didn't want to step forward. But I'll point out, the key to that happening was we got lucky. So we had 10 interested prospects, right? None of them wanted to pull the trigger, right? And so I talked to every venture capitalist on the planet that year. And I found that what I describe as the last venture capital firm on the planet that wanted to get into tech. This was summer of 2001, right? So they were late on that. And you have to be careful how you give out the references. They want to talk to customers or prospects. You can't have a prospect, though, get 10 calls from 10 different investors. That doesn't inspire confidence either, so you have to ration these. Well, so I gave 3 to this investor, and they had a summer barbecue that August. Turns out their next-door neighbor was one of the champions at one of the other accounts. And so randomly it comes up, this really exciting company that they're working with, they're looking to invest in one, so they had their inside reference. Because they had the inside reference, they had the confidence to invest, even though the world was like a mess in September of 2001. So that's why don't ever underestimate the power of luck.
That's great. How about you, Oren? You want to
Well, I can't say that Ruckus started actually as a company that did video streaming within the home. It was a totally different idea, totally different. It was called Video 54 back then. And the technology was cool, but the market, it just wasn't really happening. At some stage, it's just a brave decision, and you can call it a pivot. This is a major pivot, basically. So it was almost to scrap it, take some of the technology, and let's do Wi-Fi, and really, again, luck and timing and all that came together, but that's really where the pivot enabled it to take off, because, again, standing there 10 years ago almost and trying to still stream video from point to point, it might have made for a small something, a module for some sort of company, but it wouldn't have got to the size that Ruckus is today. But one thing I do want to go back to, actually, when you're talking about service providers, where I in no way want to tell service provider how to do their job, I will say that almost every thread, if I go back to every experience I had as a startup, also as a service provider and even to Ruckus, is that, like Steve said, you're trying to push them to be more innovative, and that's where you find that one person in the side, the service provider, who is forward-leaning, who is willing to take risks, who wants to make things happen, and identifying that person, and he will be your friend usually. And he is trying to sometimes move away from these big companies, which I will not name, and I might have worked there before in some of those companies. But, and once you find him, and he's your mentor, and that just makes a world of difference when he's basically doing the work for you. And obviously, you have to make him happy and do everything to make him happy.
So really finding across, whether it's the investors and finding the right customers, or working with the service providers, finding that champion, that mentor, that person who can be that right reference and get you to that next stage, it sounds like it's very key.
Right, and also, going back to your question also, so yes, so a lot of now carriers have CTO offices, of course, that are pretty innovative. So, some CTOs have been there, of course, for a while, but some CTOs, recent CTOs are very innovative. So one of the things we saw was one of the bigger operators here in the US, he was looking at containers and virtualization. I mean, a lot of, and 2 years ago, which was very forward thinking for them at least. But we started seeing that, as opposed to in 2000, when a lot of operators, they said, we don't want to work with startups anymore because, all the telecom nuclear storm we had back then. So there was a period of time, almost 10 years, that companies large operators didn't want to work with startups because, they didn't want to invest in that environment. So that's changed a lot. I think in the last 2-3 years, we've seen operators really excited to work with startups through the CTO office or others. Even we're working with some of the big ones I just mentioned, and they know we're a small company, but we have something very unique and they have a problem set also, which is also exciting. So they immediately want to work with us. They've bypassed all the certifications or the year testing they have to do. They push into production. So it's a very exciting time for us. And it is getting to the right operator, and as you said, getting the right person who wants to take a risk. At the same time, also understand that they have the problem set, right? So, operators, as you get more and more innovative because of new services you have to do, like Verizon. I mean, the business is changing completely for Verizon from being a fixed line operator. They're selling all their products to Frontier and others, and they're going into Yahoo. That's a huge change for them. So those are type of innovative operators that one would be very interested in talking to, especially offering something very innovative. So that's how I would go after the sort of top tier carriers who are innovative in each of those geographies they are in. Right?
Right.
What's helpful to understand, though, is that 10-year gap, a lot of it has to do with there wasn't some big change. Like the big change going on now, this SDN, NFV, the implications are just all over the place. So there's all these new problems that crop up, and they're cropping up so quickly. There's kind of no choice but to work with those that are innovating more quickly, right? And so you get this period of being very open-minded when there's such a big architectural shift going on in their business, right? And so it's a good time to be doing it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I
Very
think
true.
Derek even talked
Very
about that
true,
this morning with some of the introductions, those inflection points, those changes, the shifts in, obviously it's the SDN NFV, we're seeing opportunities, 5G coming on, IoT, the types of things you connect to, and the services you do on the network, whether you're consumer, business, enterprise, or an IoT type play. There's lots of changes happening across the board, and it's great to hear that there is some mindset shift and even probably some process shift at some of these carriers and operators that make it easier or a way to find an entrance and more of an open ear to work with startups and probably even with some of the other technology companies out there and solutions players as well, opportunity to work with them. I'm going to see, does anybody in the audience want to have any questions? We've got some mics out here. Love to hear if you have anything to glean some great insights and takeaways from these guys. Everybody's very quiet out here.
After lunch.
After lunch, yeah.
After lunch. Do you have any questions for the audience? We can switch it around. But no, anything, where do you want to be in a couple years? I mean, what do you think it's going to then take, or are there any changes in the ecosystem you'd like to see to kind of help you get to that next level? And maybe one thing to throw in there is, how important are partnerships to you as well? I mean, do you go it alone as a small startup, or do you really try to build partnerships with others to then sort of collectively jump in?
So that last point, I mean, every company and it's contextual, right? There's depends on where you sit, whether you're dependent on someone else bringing you in, or you kind of can stand on your own, right? A slightly different thing which I'll raise, which I think is very important for startups, is to recognize that well, as you go through that crossing the chasm, that framework, what gets you successful in that early piece is very different than what gets you successful later. And where this really translates is when you bring in experienced sales, right? And so, sales is all about repeating something successfully, right? So the most successful salespeople have been in places where they could repeat the same thing over and over again. But when you're in your formative phases, figuring it out, you have nothing to repeat yet, okay? What you're trying to do is learn. The most valuable thing is learning, right? Whereas the most valuable thing when you're repeating is qualification and just figuring out, are they ready to buy? Right? And so if you go too early and bring in a selling mentality, you will never you will never navigate that product market fit. So teams that bring on and keep in mind, there's a confirmation bias. Like a successful salesperson has spent 99% of their career in the repeat mode. So all of their instincts and intuition are about that mode, which are the wrong instincts when you're trying to figure things out, be a collaborative partner, and innovate. And that's probably a good universal lesson for everyone that's trying to bring a new technology to market.
Right.
Very good point.
Yeah, Steve's got a very good point about that, about sales. And we experienced that also. We had brought in different people at different phases of the company, and now we're at a stage where it's more repetitive in nature. That's very true. And one of the things also we saw was, do we want to partner or do we want to go direct, right? And of course, as a startup, it's interesting to partner with large vendors, of course, but of course the large vendors also want to see references just like anyone else. So we had to really, sort of roll up our sleeves and get into the carriers ourselves through, as I said, a myriad of contacts from sales guys to advisors, so the people that we have. And we've been lucky in the sense that as we've been, the Valley offers a tremendous amount of opportunity and contacts here in the Valley. There's some incredible people here. And so we got the CTO of AT&T as one of our advisors. We had one of the ex-CEOs of AT&T also. So we've got some really good advisors that have the deep context in a lot of these environments. So one thing we did was we definitely went directly to the carriers. We built the product for them. We deployed the product for them. And now all the vendors are excited to work with us, which is really interesting, right? So, we initially talked to the vendors as anyone did, but of course there was a lot of analysis and sort of, I wouldn't say paralysis, but you're stuck in the product management group as opposed to the sales group, right? And you really want to go to the sales guys because those are the guys that can actually sell the product. And so what we saw was, let's go to the sales process, i.e. excite them, because through their customers, they'll get excited. So when I throw out those brand names, now the vendor's excited to work with us. So that's where we're seeing that's done. But we definitely had to do a lot of things ourselves initially.
So yeah, so do a lot yourself, but then get some good advisors that really helped you as well.
Right, exactly,
right.
Yeah, well, one amusing thing I can say now is that Ruckus is at the stage is that we're facing, when we're talking to service providers, we're facing these small startups who are promising things and being very aggressive, and people are now rolling their eyes at Ruckus saying, really, now we're the incumbent, and we turned into the ones that they're saying about us that we're less flexible, and it's just, it's the nature of scale, like you said. I mean, we have now.
One of the challenges is because you're success. I mean, I've done this. I've actually tried to innovate in multiple markets in a previous company, and it wasn't until I created a separate business unit that was divorced from all of the other processes so they could just do things differently. Right. Because if you have one sales force trying to do this, they're bringing all their sales process and hygiene, right? And they also have much better references elsewhere. So they're going to do the things that are easy versus it's hard work to get your initial set of references, right?
And that's where large companies go and acquire smaller companies just to bypass the whole process itself. So yeah, that's a struggle now when you're, again, you want to scale, but you still want to be that lean and mean and responsive company.
Right. So it's very interesting to talk about how the struggles change as you grow, and not everything's going to be the same. And as you said before, the keys to success are very different at different stages. So you need to keep that open mind in terms of how to do that. We've got a couple more minutes left. So just want to see if any of you want to sort of make a few wrap-up comments, kind of free-for-all, or ask questions to each other and see, what else do you want to make points about today in terms of getting to that success level that you're at?
I mean, there's no linear path. You have to, you have to just keep at it, keep learning, and eventually you'll figure out the right way to frame a solution to a problem, right? The worst thing you can do is take, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and regardless of what I'm hearing, keep doing that, right? Like, you have to expect that you've got a half-baked idea, and you've got to fully bake it, and you're only going to get that through engaging with people, being willing to continue to change it. And even when you're, along the way, we're on our third generation solution, right? The second generation, we intended to put into production, but then we continued innovating and realized that, we're better off waiting 6 months, put the next gen, with the cost structure, everything is going to be so much better, right? Like, don't get, just because you set an expectation with a board, we're going to deliver X on this date, things change. A plan is a basis for change, right? We got to remember that.
So have some structure, but also some openness, and you might start out baking a cake and end up baking cookies, but yeah, okay, great.
Right. Yeah. And so my thing, I think, more on the sort of the process we went through as a company, right? So one thing definitely is if you're starting a company or we're doing things, I think the key is to make sure the market's really there. I know IoT is very exciting and all that, but you got to really make sure whatever solution you have, there's actually a market for it. Otherwise, you'll end up waiting for the market, which is difficult. And VCs have 18 months of sort of outlook, right? So you got to be really careful on that. So one of the things is really make sure the market's there, there's a demand there, make sure you have some early deployments or early customers that can then take you to the next step as the market develops. And of course, you don't want to be too late in the market because, of course, then it's a different process when you have multiple vendors in the Wi-Fi space example. But of course, they did very successful in that space. Ruckus did. So you got to make sure that's the case. So not too early to the market, not too late to the market, and make sure that you can actually get into the market at the right time to actually grow the company. Because we ended up waiting for the market, and that's why we had to pivot a lot. That's my advice.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, Oren?
Yeah, I just go back to being humble, which is kind of an antithesis to the things that you see around here a lot of the times. So being humble and really trying to listen to what they're saying, but also finding that either single sponsor or going back to what we were talking about partners, finding those partners who are sitting at professional services or OSS, BSS level at operators, and they can also bring you in as a small startup a lot of the times if you're a kind of a vertical addition to what they have. That I've seen a lot of success stories through that too.
Great. Well, thank you all. Really good points you've brought out, and hopefully it was really helpful for the audience. You've got something to take back and think about in your own businesses. Thank you.
Susan. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you.